Hello, thank you very much for joining me. First things first, who am I? I'm Zippy, but you really don't care about that. Why am I making this video? I'm bored and have nothing else to do on my Tuesday evenings. What makes me qualified to make this video? Absolutely nothing. Do I know what I'm talking about? Of course not. Is the information in this video accurate? After my previous answers, you can probably come to the conclusion that it's probably not. Is this a very surface level video and not at all useful to people who know anything about the topic? Spot on. Is this my first ever video project? Sort of. It's the first one I'm going to release. There is something else in the works, but that's going to be a couple of years down the line probably, but for the sake of this, then yeah, it is. Is this video any good and should you watch it? No and no. But if you do, I hope you leave thinking this wasn't a total waste of your time. Right, so preamble part 2 is that if you hear any bangs in the background, that's because I stupidly decided to start recording this on fireworks night or bonfire night in the UK. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then I'm sorry, go and Google it. If you do know what I'm talking about and you're just angry that there's going to be the occasional firework, don't blame me, blame a guy called Guy Fawkes a couple hundred years back. And the final thing to point out before we carry on is that I sound very weird through a microphone. That's not the microphone's fault, that's my fault. I sound weird in real life. You're just going to have to put up with my voice. No matter what I get, no matter what equipment I have, I always sound just as annoying. So you're just going to have to power through. I don't care if you think I'm annoying and you want to go away, that's fine. I'd rather you do something that isn't going to irritate you tonight. But please be aware that I've done my best to try and make me as unirritating as possible, and I haven't managed to achieve all that much of it. But we'll just get started with the video, shall we?
In the beginning,
So, I have a bit of an interest in military affairs, equipment, history, and general war stuff. Not enough to be considered an expert in any field in particular, or even very knowledgeable at that, for that matter. But I like things, and often that's the only thing that matters in life. Occasionally, something happens that is big, like really big, and I stop and pay a little more attention to it. Not because it's brilliant, but because I sit there and go, huh, in a somewhat contemplative way and ponder this new concept for a while. And unfortunately, since the 24th of February 2022, there have been many of these moments, which is fairly tragic when I think about the frequency of the times I thought, to myself. And this video is kind of an extension of one of those things I've been thinking about. Look, I just thought today I would delve into one of those topics, possibly the biggest one for me, and just ruminate aloud. There's nothing new in this video, nothing you won't have heard before, nothing you won't have already seen online. I'm not going to go into specifics because frankly that's never really that important, and I don't really have the knowledge to be ultra insightful anyway, but perhaps my cluttered brain will spew out something that you may like to spend a few minutes indulging in. Just to touch up on that, I mentioned that I won't be talking about specifics, and that is true. Even though I will be talking about equipment, I personally can't tell you about specific models of things, and frankly, that's usually not that important enough to be brought up anyway. A Wodjamajig V1 and a Dinglema-Flip A316 Star T mean nothing to me, and in reality, unless it's really important, we can just assume that they are roughly the same. So if you want detailed analysis on the tech, that ain't gonna happen here, so go watch someone else. So, without any further ado, what is it that made me just sprout up from my catatonic torpor and go, hey, that's kinda new? Like many people, I have been keeping up to date with the Russian invasion of Ukraine for quite some time, looking in for daily updates, etc. And whilst I have donated to the defenders, I haven't been all that active in any other way. All I've basically done is sat online and watched footage of what's going to be possibly the most heavily studied conflict outside of the two major conflicts at the beginning of the 20th century. It's arguably the first modern peer versus peer international war since possibly the Falklands conflict, and there's a lot of footage floating around that shows the Cold War had it gone hot, or at least what it would have been like at the very minimum. Both sides are using 20th century equipment, with the occasional smattering and splattering of modern tech. It's really, really interesting to people like me. As someone with a deep fascination of the Great War, it's giving me true 1914 to 1918 vibes, and it's not just the trenches alone. And clearly, the big innovation that has come to the forefront are drones. The ability to fly a building demolishing explosive with pinpoint accuracy into Vatnik Petroplagigovic Jakov's morning mud coffee, which in my opinion describes all coffee, through a window on the other side of the country with VR goggles and subsequently post the footage online so people like me can watch it with our wine-stained trousers and go, "Whoa!" is really rather terrifying and in equal parts impressive. Drones have played a massive role on the battlefield for quite some time now, but now the tech has been nailed down and the rate at which these quad bombardiers are being produced and the price at which they're being made for has totally changed the view of this war for many of us. Yes, there are many limitations and the battlefield hasn't changed significantly because of them, but they have made an explosive impact on those on the ground. So, imagine my surprise when in the spring of 2024, at the point where more and more high-tech equipment was being sent by the West to Ukraine, when experimental weapons from the last 30 years were being thrown to the boys in yellow and blue to see how effective they are, and when the Ukrainians seemed to have completely ground Russia's offensive to a halt, we saw the footage of a Russian assault being led by a garden shed. Frankly, it's bizarre. I remember at the time the internet was awash with laughter. This thing was trundling across a field with some other tanks in support. And what the hell was getting on Russia? I mean, it got lost twice in an open field. Twice. You have to remember, at the time this footage surfaced, Russia had seemed to have worked out the failures from its previous 2 years of fighting. They had scrapped the battalion tactical group, their ammo situation seemed to have been fixed, and their infantry were not posting videos of them screaming at their generals for throwing them at the enemy lines under-equipped. So there was a bit of a muted collective worry across a lot of us online, with, well, still fervent in the belief that Ukraine will win, but that the slog would get a little sloggier. But then this footage dropped and we lost our collective mind at the spectacle. The footage was analysed by the internet's top minds because it was the weirdest thing they had seen in months, and it suddenly dawned on everybody, this is the stupidest thing in the world, literally ever. Nothing was worse than this. Russia was claiming that the T-14 Armata, the greatest thing, inanimate or otherwise, was soon to make an appearance in the war to extinguish all life, past and present, and instead we were presented with the battle box. It was laughable. In the video, it lumbers over to a tree line, turns around, and then just flees. Initially, the word all around the internet was that it was the work of a single Russian tank crew, who were so scared about being hit by an anti-tank missile that they made an external structure for their own vehicle. It's also worth pointing out that this was also seen as an extension of the cope cage, a net or corrugated iron sheet placed over the commander's copula and other escape hatches that the Ukrainians were targeting with drones to drop grenades in or to use top-down explosives from anti-tank missiles. These cope cages did work though, so well in fact that Ukrainians are installing the cope cages on their vehicles, just like the ones that were seen trundling over the border into Kursk not all that long ago. So initially, this was seen as a rather over-engineered version of those cope cages. If you're interested as to why the cope cages were so heavily used on Russian tanks, go and have a look at the ammunition storage in a T-72. It should become very apparent why dropping a grenade into those things right in the centre of where they store the ammo was going to cause a lot of problems for the Russians. So, some Rusky got overjoyous with a welder and made his tank bulky and silly. So what? It's the only one and it doesn't work, right? Right? Well, it turns out he was not the only one. And maybe they had a point. For the rest of the year, and I assume this will progress into the next year too, more and more of these abominations began to manifest on the battlefield. There have been dozens of confirmed and recorded sightings of these behemoths. And, well, for better or worse, they are really very interesting.
What's that?
Like I said, the emergence of these vehicles got some major internet attention, first being called the Blyatmobile, and then their current name became more prominent shortly thereafter, the Turtle Tank. It should be pointed out that the Russians call these things the Tsar tanks, which is an odd choice considering what happened to Mr. Nicholas, but who am I to lecture them on their own history? I'm sure they know it. Multiple examples of these became apparent, and many questions surround them even now, nearly a year after they first burst onto the scene. Look, the obvious questions have only been answered over time, which I intend to go through, but there are still some unknowns that we are yet to find out. Here is the takeaway from this video. We do not know all that much about them, frankly. Only in the future, once the dust settles and the turtles go into hibernation, will we know what the hell was going on with these things. Until that time, we have to put together what we can, and this video will hopefully serve as an introduction to people who are interested in these things. So, my dude, I bet the first question you're asking is, what the hell is with the design of these things? In which I must answer, you are a fool. I don't mean that really. You're inquisitive, so that's always a good thing. The reality is, there's not one set design. This is what's probably the most interesting thing about them. They're basically all ad hoc. There are lots of different styles that are coming out, so many that I couldn't include all of them in this video, but a number of general rules are coming out, and a couple of different variations of style, should we say, a couple of different general design points are coming across, which I'm going to go through now. And so, in order to show you what you mean, I have put together a collection of photos that I'll be showing on screen now of some of the turtle tanks that are currently showing up on the battlefields of Ukraine. And as you can see, it looks like the world's least cohesive scrapyard catwalk. I doubt you'd get very much money if you just walked into a junkyard with some of this stuff and said, "Hi, how much can I make from this scrap value?" The reality is, it's all very poor, it's all very crudely put together. A couple of them are better than others. You'll see the box tank at some point in this video, which does actually look like some competence went into it, but the vast majority look very improvised and very, very, very bad, and quite funny. There are two I want to bring up in particular, however, that I will show on screen now. The first one is the one I like to call the Rubber Wally, because that is literally a tank with a substructure of some kind with lots of rubber panels thrown on it. We know they're rubber because we actually have the Telegram post begging people if they can actually get some rubber to the front line. We also have some photos of the guy who delivered it on the back of a flatbed truck. This is peak amazing. I don't know how to describe it. Mainly the reason I love it is because it looks like an elephant, and I can't really describe how much joy that brings me. It looks silly and I want it. I don't think it's going to be that combat effective. It'll be great against shrapnel, but pretty much everything else I think it's going to fall problems to, mainly because Russia's now being attacked by thermite drones and rubber does tend to burn. Just throwing it out there. The other one we need to talk about is this one. This is the one I call the internet's darling, because people fell in love with it the moment they saw it for two reasons. One, because it looks like a hedgehog, and two, and probably more importantly, because we found out some more information about some of these tanks because of something that came along with it, and I will be talking about that much later on in the video. Remember this tank, the internet's darling, remember it. Now we've got those two out of the way, time for a couple of other features that are common amongst a lot of these tanks. A lot of them, the armour is very thin. We're talking corrugated metal, stamp sheet metal, stuff that just is designed to be thin and just generally purposeful, just quick. I need something on a roof, I'll get this corrugated iron sheeting. That's now being used to defend Russian soldiers. How good is that? We then also have things like this one. This has explosive reactive armour on the outside of its armour, just in case you're not confident enough that the very thin metal you've got there is going to protect the tank. You need something just a bit more. So you stick explosive reactive armour, or ERA, on it, and that survives a bit better, probably, I don't know. You then also have things like this. These have got chains on them, probably to prevent FPV drones, but to not stop access via just getting in and out of the tank, which you do need to be able to do. Getting into your tank is something that is quite useful at the end of the day if you want to use it. We then also have things like this, just an amalgamation of just bits. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about this one other than it looks awful. You then also have something a bit more like this. This door appears to be on the side of the tank, which is actually making a bit of sense, because usually if the tank is hit or the crew need to get out, usually get out of the front. The problem with that is that tanks tend to be offensive weapons, especially when the turrets are facing forward, like in these. And then if you get out of the tank, then you have to then get out in the way of the Ukrainians. They are shooting at the front of your tank, you are getting out the front of your tank, you are going to get splatted in the dome. So what you do is you stick the way of getting out on the side, gives you a bit more protection. Makes sense. The other thing that you're going to see is that a lot of these tanks have got limited turret rotation. Things like the chains that we've got here that are here to stop FPV drones, those will be ripped out of their housing if the turret tries to turn. Some of them have got the turret completely immobilized, as we'll see a great example of this later on. Finally, there's a bit of a mystery I want to put towards you. Right at the beginning of seeing these turtle tanks, I am convinced, and I know one other person that believes it as well, that we saw a picture of a turtle tank that was made of wood. Like those actually had logs instead of metal. We are convinced it's out there. We are sure we've both seen this photo independently of each other. Now, we could be wrong, and I don't want you to walk away from this video saying that that did actually happen, because I have no proof of it, and the burden of proof should always be on the person who's telling you what's going on. So, for argument's sake, no, it doesn't exist, but I'm convinced it does. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to leave a quick photo of what I think it would have looked like.
So, what you're saying is, I'm indestructible.
Oh, no, no. In fact, even a slight breeze could...
Indestructible.
Now, because of my ceaseless generosity, and you can thank me later, you now have an image in your head about the certain types of turtle tanks that are out there, so we can now start to get a picture of what is going on. After all, Russia doesn't seem to be pumping out all that much info on these beasts. We can mainly get all of our information that Russia knows from the Telegram channels or the mill bloggers that happen to be going to the front line to get some of this information on video for us, but we have to piece it all together ourselves. So, what are the common features of this motley collection of scrap and motor oil? Surprisingly, there isn't all that much in common between them. The only real major similarity is that they are all massive in comparison to other Russian military vehicles of the current day. In all of the footage I have seen, they dwarf all other vehicles around them. They are not stealthy. The metal monstrosities are unlikely to be sneaking about on their way to the front lines. I suspect you could not park one of these things behind a small forest and expect the Ukrainians not to notice it, even if they were in a trench 8 miles away, being shelled so they got their heads down during night through a dense fog. It's as if some Russians one night decided to look up how Churchill came up with the world's first tank development project, saw that he created the Land Ship Committee. Focusing in on the word ship, they remembered how most ships are massive, powerful, and unsinkable. Forgot which part of that list was the important part for a tank, stared at each other in a moment of misguided enthusiasm, glanced over at the pile of broken refrigerators in the corner of their occupied barn, and rushed for an acetylene torch. An ever-increasing number of these tanks seem to have doors or at least hatches on them. Often on the rear, but we will come to this later on. At the very least, access seems to be important, otherwise the crew would just clamber out of the hole at the front of the tank, as there is often a gap at the front for the driver to see out of and for the barrel to stick out of too. The one thing I will point out here is that if you are having to get out of a tank, usually it's because you've been hit and you're on fire, which usually means you're in the middle of combat, which usually means the front of the tank is going to be facing towards the enemy, who are usually going to be shooting back at you. Something to point out, when you're destroying a tank, usually the most important thing you're destroying is not the tank, but the crew. A tank is replaceable. The crew can get out of a tank and go and find a new tank to get in and drive off to the front line again. If you kill the crew, that's a lot of training that somebody else needs to take up. We do know that the Russians aren't getting all that much training at the moment, so maybe that point is less effective, and Russia also has a good number of tanks still available in inventory, but it's just something to consider that if you're putting survivability high up on the list, you might not just want a hole at the front for the crew to clamber out of. To further on that point, the open space at the front is sometimes covered with a thick chain mesh or steel grate for some added protection against first-person view drones, which I shall simply be referring to as FPV drones from now on. It's almost always free hanging, but there have been a few that appear to have these defences attached both to the turret and to the chassis of the tank. In that particular case, that renders the turret completely useless. because it cannot turn, else it would start ripping that defense out of its alignment and casing on the chassis, defeating the point of having it in the first place. Almost all of the turtle tanks we've been seeing have sloped armor. You can debate amongst yourselves how effective sloped armor actually is, but it's usually not very thick, usually thin sheet steel, like the stuff that is used for cheap fencing and that is very common around Ukraine in much of the rural areas that we've been seeing in videos during the Ukrainian liberation attempts. The other thing I'm also seeing is a lot of stamped sheet metal being used, stuff that's very thin, that's just there so that machinery can just punch it into the right shape. Presumably, it is used to stop drone drop grenades landing on top and punching a way through to the top of the armour, instead rolling down the sides onto the floor where it detonates harmlessly, or just so that anything that hits the armour and detonates is further away from the tank than when the big boom happens. The only uniform aspect amongst all of them is that they appear to be rustier than me trying to play my trombone after not going near the damn thing for nearly 14 years. God, I'm old. And you have to wonder, how the hell is this supposed to protect the crew? Rusty metal is not very strong. It's generally considered to be a lot weaker than pretty much any metal you can get your hands on. And like earlier mentioned, most of the materials these things are being made out of are not particularly beefy. So if it's not particularly protective, what are these tanks being used for?
Oh, bugger, the tank is on fire.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
I mentioned earlier that this war is going to be remembered in years to come for one thing, the evolution of drone warfare. Now, it's not the first time drones have been used in combat to great effect. British and American forces made fantastic use of them in Afghanistan, but these were more often the either really big Air Force ones, such as Reapers, or the very small unit observational drones such as the minuscule Black Hornet, which incidentally is being used by Ukrainian forces right now. These drones were ideal for the tasks that were required of them, but the task required of them was either pummeling insurgents with high-yield precision explosive from miles away, or figuring out where said insurgents are and directing infantry to neutralise the threat, effectively clearing the fog of war for those on the ground. Both of these activities are still performed by drones in Ukraine, long-range strikes by Turkish Bayraktars and close observation by the aforementioned Black Hornets, but another technique has come to the forefront that is that of the drone-dropped ordnance. I should explain, the Reaper drone employed by the US, as well as many similar vehicles by a large number of developed nations, utilise missiles that are simply carried by the unmanned, not unarmed, that's difficult to say with dyslexia, the unmanned craft, and specifically target problematic peoples at a very long distance away. These vehicles are large, like plane-sized large, and cost eye-watering sums. The Reaper I've mentioned a few times now costs slightly more than 30 million freedom bucks for the drone alone. That's not including the ammunition. Or to put it in a way that everyone can understand and visualise, that's 168,681 bottles of Martell's XO Cognac. I'm not sponsored by Martell's, I just really like it. But if they were to come to me and say, you know, would you like a bit of money just to shill our product? The answer is yes. But like seriously, if you're gonna have a drink, have something you like. Don't have lager. It's one of the things that really annoys me. That's like walking into a pet shop to buy a forever animal and walking out with a jar of fleas that had latched onto the one rescue dog at the back, huddled over in the corner, waiting a loving owner to take it home. You leave knowing you made a mistake, that you cheaped out for the sake of buying something, anything, and you will regret it the moment you open it up to attempt to enjoy its contents. Cognac does not deceive you. It's lovely and sophisticated, and it gives you those puppy dog eyes from the shelf when you come home from work each day to give you that perfect start to your evening of learning, which is what you're doing now, which is kind of perfect if you think about it. Sorry about that, distraction over. I was talking about drones, wasn't I? Ah, yes, big American drones makes many men go splat, but what if you have very little money? Oh no, what do I do? Well, there is this book-selling website called Amazon, and they have some cheap quadcopters on there. They have cameras and can move fast, so they must have a lot of thrust, and I have in my hand a little splody sphere with a pin and a spoon, and the mind whirs, and you fork over 400 spondulics to this Amy zone, and you wait, and a package turns up in the mail. But now, you have a way to get a grenade delivered into a trench over 30 times further than you could throw it with pinpoint accuracy. Times, however, they are changing. What we are seeing is that Ukraine is now no longer buying from Amazon and is essentially building their own drones from scratch. Things that are much more resistant to jamming, which we will go into in a second. The Russians, they are basically going the same sort of way in developing their own drones, but they're going for wire-guided drones, and there are advantages to both, but both of them are moving away from just the commercial off-the-shelf ones, which were very susceptible to a number of drone solutions. Subsequently, it is no surprise that the realization of this has dramatically changed combat. You can now give a fairly poor country an effective, hard-to-counter mini air force. And it's effective, as can be seen daily on Reddit. I have lost count of the number of men I have seen hit by drone-dropped ordnance on r/combat footage and r/Ukraine war video reports. To give you an idea of how big a problem this is proving to be, the abundance of these drones on the battlefield is having a seriously damaging psychological effect on the invaders. For just yesterday, as the day of writing this, 31st of October 2024, I saw a drone with night vision capabilities fly within about 10 to 20 feet of a Russian soldier alone in a foxhole at night, who then presumably, from the sound of the drone alone, is so scared he shoots himself in the head with his own rifle. Now, I could be macabre, facetious, or silly about all of this, which are all things I tend to be, but in all seriousness, this is what warfare has become. Cheap drones can now inflict incredible damage on the battlefield. The other reason I'm not joking about this is because I'm staunchly pro-Ukraine, and Russia is using these same drones to fight against Ukraine. Not anywhere near as many from what I can tell, but the reality is there are going to be a lot of young Ukrainian men and women who are going to have some amazingly difficult PTSD to deal with later on in life because of this, and it's absolutely tragic. Now, the real tragedy of this is that they shouldn't have to be dealing with this at all. But it's not just infantry that have to worry about these new weapons of war. Drone drop munitions have been used to disable or even destroy tanks in some cases. Here is something to consider. You are a tanker, you want to park up after a long day of shooting and presumably missing Ukrainians, and you want a cup of tea, or whatever it is the Russian equivalent of tea is, mud-filtered tepid vodka presumably. No stereotyping on this channel unless we get to the French, obviously. So you hop out of your tank and you set up a stove not too far away to have a little drinky poo. Because of this, you leave the hatches open, which are all on top of the tank, which up until 2022 has not been all that much of an issue. And then, in walks Petro, a well-looked-after, conversational and intelligent man from Mykolaiv, a ladies' man at that, with an interest in puppies, long walks on the beach and donating to charity. He spots an open tank hatch from his drone, and he happens to be carrying a small payload underneath it. He thinks for a second and drops his grenade into the open hatch. After a minor catastrophic detonation, the Russians are now down a tank for the cost of a grenade and the electricity it costs to recharge the drone. After this revelation, Russia decided to respond with making cope cages, nets or sheets of metal over the hatches to prevent drone drop grenades. This, as silly as it looked at the time, worked very well. It became rather rare to see turret tosses because of drones. Not entirely gone, but much reduced. It should also be pointed out that the cope cages are made with the intent of protecting against top attack munitions such as Javelin or Enlil, but the effectiveness of this is dubious. Foiled but not deterred, Ukraine needed a new response. They started thinking until one man asked, what if, hear me out, what if you could send a high explosive charge much higher than a grenade at high velocity into the side of a tank accurately enough that you could avoid any added additional armour? And with that, first-person view drones were born. By strapping an imperial buttsload of C4 to a drone, finishing it off with a front-mounted electronic detonator that activates when two pieces of metal contact each other and complete a circuit, you have what is essentially an artillery shell that can be used to target, well, anything, but mainly able to annihilate T-80s all day long. There was a brief period in 2023 where people on the internet thought this was the be-all and end-all of combat, that Russian armour had no chance, no matter how big the target was. I genuinely saw some people claim that the Admiral Kuznetsov would finally be sunk by the Ukrainian forces, despite the fact it's currently on the opposite side of Russia, And frankly, it probably isn't going to be needed. The Admiral Kuznetsov has been trying to sink itself for the past 20 years, but that's neither here nor there. People thought that anything that the Russians did was going to be defeated by an unrelenting wave of FPV drones, and there was nothing they could do to halt it or prevent it happening. That's when the spring of 2024 came around, and we saw the emergence of the turtle tanks via that clip I spoke about at the beginning. And we laughed. And then a short while later, we didn't anymore, because what we thought was a stupid idea turned out to have some merits, as hard as it is to say. At least a little. It's still a stupid idea, but it's not as entirely stupid as we initially had thought. We have discussed now how they are thinly armoured. Well, explosives, put simply, get exponentially weaker the further away the detonation is from the thing you're trying to destroy. By having another layer of armour in the way from the tank's hull, you reduce the chance of any damage being dealt to the tank upon the explosion. The drone detonates on the external armour, which also absorbs some of the damage, and the rest of the tank gets off relatively scot-free. The Russian media have celebrated this, in passing, by saying it's a new revelation in warfare, when it turns out that this new turtle tank armour is a cheaper, less cool and less effective version of something that's been used extensively since the first generation of tanks, the amazing concept of spaced armour. France, as pained as I am to admit it, was the first to use spaced armour on their absolutely terrible ugly twins of World War I, the Schneider CA-1 and the Saint-Chamond. Spaced armour was placed at the front of the hull to protect the main chassis from shrapnel and other obstacles that littered the battlefield, but also to protect against solid projectiles. The way in which this works I shall describe shortly, however it didn't entirely protect the tanks from being crap. So in reality it didn't really catch on initially. The story behind these two is really interesting actually. It's a tale of how France intended to make one tank accidentally, and I do genuinely mean accidentally, ended up designing 5 different tanks, producing 3 of them, and for reasons that are very complicated to explain, the 2 tanks I mentioned earlier were copies of each other because of an unreal and apocalyptic amount of Frenchness, leaving the one that was originally intended for production and the one that was conceptually impossible being the ones that weren't built. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend the Laserpig video on the subject. It's silly and informative, the 2 things I like in life, so I'll leave the link in the description. After a brief pause in the fighting of World War I, approximately 21 years of it, there was another, more successful attempt at spaced armour, which, even though there were other attempts in the meantime, showed that the concept actually had legs and people started paying more attention to it after this. The German tank designs of World War II often featured spaced armour, or the capability to have it mounted at the very least. This armour was most notably appearing on the Panzer IIIs and IVs, most commonly as a ring around the turret. It worked rather well in fact, mainly against anti-tank rifles, which were basically effective for the first Thursday of the war, but then were immediately useless after that, and then some high explosives such as Piets and general shrapnel. It wasn't always enough to prevent the tank from being obliterated, but it was a cheap enough and effective enough way of preventing the tank from being destroyed every single time, and it did in fact work to some extent. Both the Allies and Axis powers discovered that spaced armour doesn't actually stop high-velocity projectiles, but breaks it up into smaller, less damaging projectiles. These are still lethal to be hit by, don't get me wrong, but it reduces the impact on the main armour of the tank behind the spaced armour once broken up and slowed down. Survivability therefore increases. Think about it this way. Would you rather somebody throw a 10-kilogram rock at you or 10 kilograms worth of pebbles? Both would suck, but at least after the pebbles you would still be able to walk to the hospital. Most tanks in World War II used armour-penetrating rounds, which are solid projectiles which would typically slice through the main body of a tank, hit something vital like the engine or ammo rack, and disable or destroy the tank from there. Man-portable high-explosive weaponry was being used from this time, such as bazookas, Piets, and rifle grenades, which did all seem to have issues getting through the spaced armour as the detonation of HE on contact, and HE, for the reasons stated earlier, really wants to be hitting whatever you want to destroy in order to do maximum damage, not something relatively close to it where the blast loses power, which is what happens with spaced armour. Yet more asides. Another one I know. A lot of people don't believe me when I say rifle grenades have been used for anti-tank roles even outside of World War I. In fact, thanks to the aforementioned French, this is still the case. Depending on the specific vehicle you're going up against, they are perfectly good anti-tank weapons. Now, it's not going to do the same as a Carl Gustav, but having something available to the infantry that gives them a fighting chance against the Soviet behemoth is generally considered to be quite a nice idea. With a heavy heart, we head back from our detour back to spaced armour. It is currently used in almost every main battle tank on the planet to some extent, even if only to cover the tops of the tracks. It is used in conjunction with many other types of armour, which makes these mobile bunkers very, very hard to crack. All of these factors show Russia did not come up with the concept of spaced armour, but the idea is really tried and tested at this point. The one thing they have done, to give them some credit, is make the spaced armour massive, to completely encapsulate the vehicle, which isn't really worth bragging about, but Russia does what Russia does. This is the main reason that this armour is being used. It is seriously good at defending against drones. The armour won't hold up to being hit by a drone, but it only needs to stop the drone once. If a drone is going to hit you, might as well make it so that the hit is not very effective. Yes, a large hole will be blown into your defences, but who cares? You have survived. This right here is why we stopped laughing at these things. They do the one thing they are intended to do: survive the first wave of drone attacks, because that's usually all you need to be able to do. Anybody who has not turned off yet is probably asking themselves, are these turtle tanks surviving all drone hits? No, drones are still destroying turtle tanks at a rate of knots, but here's the thing, turtle tanks do not operate alone. You have to put a lot of effort and a lot of drones into destroying a single turtle tank, or considerably less effort in destroying the rest of the column behind it. You see, these turtles tend to be at the head of assaults, but tend to survive where most of the other vehicles behind them tend to be ripped to pieces rather quickly. So with this revelation, the arms race had begun. Something that a lot of people have kind of forgotten, but I think we all need to remember from time to time, is that the reality of combat is that things change, and when your foe develops something new, that works no less, you need to adapt. When the British and Americans first came across the Tiger, they didn't just throw their hands up in the air and go, well, that's better than anything we've got, let's go back to the drawing board. No, actually, you know what, Germany, you've won this, we can't do anything about this, let's just go home and go and enjoy ourselves. You win, congratulations, enjoy the spoils of war, Mr. Mustachioed Man. Russia had the concept of throwing these tanks at the head of an assault, and more often than previously, these attacks showed results. So it became popular. Ukraine had to adapt, and by adapt I mean throw more drones at them, and lay mines. Many mines. Many, many mines. Many, 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 many mines. The turtle tank was being swarmed by drones, as one would blow a hole in the outer cage and another one would flow into the now exposed hole and hit the body directly. This was a very successful strategy and has been claimed as such by both sides. However, I have yet to see this actually happen outside of a couple of immobilized ones, so I'm a little dubious about how this actually works in the middle of combat. One thing I can attest to is the biggest loss of turtle tanks is to anti-tank mines. Here's the thing. The ground in Ukraine is currently 8% soil and 92% high explosive. I know this is accurate as I personally conducted a soil experiment and was literally blown away by the results. Crap joke of the year award goes to me. But in all seriousness, both sides are laying mines in their tens of thousands. The ground is rigged to detonate at the first sign of movement. You cannot get a single vehicle to start its engine without a significant boom happening somewhere in the vicinity of it. The reality is the turtle tank happens to have the same weakness that pretty much every other armoured fighting vehicle has, in that you don't expect to be blown up from underneath. When you are getting blown up from underneath, it's because there is a minefield, and people tend to know where minefields are. The other big problem about armouring the underside of your tank is that if the enemy finds out that their mines are not strong enough to go through the armour, they tend to build a higher yield explosive, capable of doing so. So then you need to armour the underside of the tank more, which just makes it heavier and it just wastes time. The reality is, the underside of the tank doesn't need to be enough to stop the tank from being immobilised, it just needs to be strong enough to stop the crew from being killed. So in the end of the day, you could add more armour to the underside of the tank, but why bother? Because of this, many turtle tanks, which are the armoured spearhead of the assault, tend to be hit by mines at an almost clockwork rate. Once a week we seem to be getting footage of another one that has rolled over a pressure-activated bomb, or a photo of one that was claimed to have had that happen. They are also getting targeted by the age-old enemy of the armoured fighting vehicle, artillery. But frankly, you can't really do much about that. If a direct hit from a 155mm NATO caliber artillery shell can rip apart an entire building, it can find its way through a mobile garage. Fortunately for the Russians, hitting a moving thing with an artillery piece is pretty difficult, because you need to hit them directly in order to do any major damage. So the only thing you need to worry about is a relatively lucky hit. There is skill involved in hitting with an artillery shell, but honestly, indirect fire is not something you can entirely rely on, no matter how good you are. So, to sum up, they can't really do anything about the artillery because that's entirely luck-based, but they do have two problems they can actually deal with: drones and mines. They have adapted to both by fitting their cheap construction projects with toys. First of all, how do you resolve the mine issue? Easy, yeah, fit your tank with a mine roller. There are three main mine rollers in service with the Russian Federation right now: the KMT-5, KMT-6, and the brand spanking new, at least in 1984, KMT-7. After a whole 2 minutes of Googling, I can answer maybe some of the questions you have for me. The rollers themselves are essentially mimicking vehicles in front of the tank. Two sets of two wheels are positioned in front of and in line with the tank's tracks, and put pressure on the ground. This detonates a good number of the pressure-activated mines in front of the tank, resulting in a safer, less pant-wetting experience for the crew. One of the neat things about how these devices works is that if the wheels aren't working, you can swap to a plough, which literally digs up the mines rather than detonating them. The plough is less capable, but if the roller is having issues due to terrain, you aren't just sat there in the middle of a minefield waiting for the engineers to come over and give you a tug. And if they're feeling like it, they can also help try and pull you out of the minefield. The KMT-7 has a chain between the two rollers that detonates sticky up fuses. Why this feature can't be bodged onto earlier versions, I don't know. After all, this entire video is about improvised tank upgrades. They have the capability of doing it. So, how are the Ukrainians dealing with this? Fortunately, they have been prepared for this for quite some time. In the various aid packages the US and other nations have provided, there have been multiple types of mines supplied, some such being magnetic mines. Now, I cannot be bothered to explain in great detail why they work and how they work as they do. All you need to know is that they are not detonated by pressure, like a lot of mines, they're detonated by a magnetic field. So, how does this work in practice? The reality is the roller on the tanks does not produce a strong enough magnetic presence to detonate the mine, but the tank, the huge steel, much more magnetically juicy contraption behind the roller, does. As a result, Ukraine currently has ways of taking out the tanks that are being protected by these anti-tank rollers. These types of mines are being used in conjunction with regular mines and other types of alternate initiators such as infrared, so the battlefield is very difficult for Russia to deal with as its tanks need to be utilising both modes on its rollers, and many more other anti-tank methods, and as such, they struggle stopping everything. I focused in on the magnetic mines just so we had a baseline to deal with, but other types of mines with other initiators are using different ways of detonating, and therefore Russia cannot cope with all of them. One final thing to bring up is that what should be stated here is that mines tend to be targeted towards mobility kills, essentially doing something that stops the vehicle from moving. Actual destruction of the vehicle is preferred, but not as likely. The Ukrainians only need to stop the thing from rolling towards them to effectively neutralise the threat. So we have just dealt with and also shown how Russia cannot deal with mines. But what about drones? Well, that's easy enough to answer. Electronic warfare, which is much less exciting than it sounds. I bet a lot of you are currently thinking Tesla coils and plasma weapons and sparks. It's not that. Time for the part of every video ever made that literally bores your face off. We like guns and tanks and planes and not zeros or ones. Hello, this is Post-Production Zippy, and I am just coming to you because the next section was very long and very boring. It didn't really go anywhere. Essentially, we're talking about electronic warfare when it comes to defeating drones. Essentially, what I was going to say, in a much more long-winded fashion, is that you're basically just trying to jam the drone. You're sending information overload to the receiver of the drone or to the drone sender, and you're basically just trying to drown out any kind of communication. Now, depending on what you've got, that's going to affect things in different ways. You don't need to worry about that. All you need to worry about is that Russia has started to put anti-drone electronic warfare systems on the top of their tanks in order to try and prevent FPV drones hitting them, or the drone-dropped ordnance from getting them, at any rate. It's not that effective. I've seen videos of some drones falling out the sky. I can't seem to find much footage of that, and maybe I'll get some by the time I edit this together. The other thing is that we're seeing just a lot of drones getting through, frankly. It doesn't seem to be affecting it all that much. It might just be the fact that they're cludging the stuff to the top of these tanks and it's not going well. I've seen reports that electronic warfare systems are being put inside the armor, which I don't think is going to help them all that much because that's going to reduce the effectiveness of the jamming equipment. It's a really difficult thing to judge and to read up on because there's not much literature out there about it. You just need to know it's happening, and it's annoying, but it's not the be all end all that everybody's saying it is. So, it's fine to be Ukrainian facing this because it's not actually affecting you all that much. End of side rant. And so mines are disabling turtle tanks, drones are still disabling turtle tanks, artillery is still disabling turtle tanks, and conventional man-portable anti-tank weaponry is still disabling turtle tanks. Why are they still making them? Because why not? Warfare is a game of advancement, iteration, and catch-up. When Russia first brought out the turtle tanks, they initially had the edge, at least for a short while. Then Ukraine came up with ways to combat them. Then the tanks were improved again. Then the Ukrainians improved again. It doesn't look like it takes a huge amount of effort to make turtle tanks based on some of the photos we've seen earlier. And if it means the Ukrainians must spend more time to destroy them, that's minorly beneficial to the Russians. If it helps them in a handful of situations, even 1 out of every 1,000 attempts, it's worth the effort. It's only a matter of time before they change again, and before Ukraine finds another more effective way to disable them. This is the natural cycle of war.
Shame it's brown.
It isn't brown.
Yes, it is.
It isn't brown, it's sunset orange.
It's not brown in the way that my car is green. It's brown.
All of this begs a question. Who is making these, and who designed them? How do we know this information, and what are their limitations? Well, this is one of those things that will come to light many, many years down the line when books are written about this war. We don't know how they came into existence, or even if the Russians got commanded to make them. There are a number of theories, but personal opinion time here, I think it's all down to a single commander, whoever he may be, and here is my thought process. The first turtle tank was introduced onto the battlefield, and then if memory serves, a second showed up not too long after that. But there was a gap of about a week if memory is correct. Now, I'm no expert in welding, but I suspect if you handed me a welder, some scrap metal, and a bus, I believe I could add a thin layer of tin to that double-decked monstrosity in a similar way within a short space of time if I had a few more helping hands, say, a tank crew. Let's arbitrarily use a 1-week time frame. Yeah, I reckon me and my small group of best mates could shackle one of those things together at a decent rate, even with all the arguing and the wedges. I personally think, and you don't have to agree with me on this, that one commander asked to put one together for a single assault. And because it survived contact with the enemy, he did the one thing we know Russians like to do, which is brag about his invention. So then the next armor commander learns of this caged contraption and orders his men build a tank like the first for his assault the next week. This kind of free thinking isn't often allowed within the Russian Federation, but honestly, they have been trying some odd stuff out recently, so who's to say they aren't changing their minds on this? Once they caught the attention of the higher-ups, bringing their men combat victories, that's when the gadgets such as the mine rollers and EW emitters get sent down from the storage depots en masse, explaining their initial infrequency on the battlefield compared to the more recent designs. We now know that these tanks are being made not too far from the front, as we now have footage of them being made, taken by Russians in makeshift depots showing off their toys. And from what we see here, we now know how crude the frame actually is. The one on screen is paper thin. There is zero chance, absolutely nada, zilch, goose egg percentile, the possibility of the square root of sweet FA, from the footage we have seen, that these are being produced systematically in a controlled environment by professionals with blueprints, prototypes, and genuine materials. Look, if these were made anywhere but just behind the front line, they would be more uniform, the materials would be fairly standardized, the steel would not be hideously corroded, and the substructures would be made of something other than bog standard steel girders. This is all heavily implying that Russia is getting all of these materials locally, the sort of parts you would typically find in a junkyard, for example. The Russians have somehow lucked out and managed to find themselves inside the largest contiguous junkyard in the world. Mind you, they were the ones that made it by shelling civilians and destroying property for nearly 3 days now. Sorry, I meant 3 years. Can't believe I made that mistake of thinking 3 days was not 3 years. God lord, that's embarrassing. I don't think it's possible to recover from that. What's particularly interesting to me is the fact that they are basically changing the purpose of the tank in order to make these modifications. The turret has typically been the defining characteristic of a tank, is always limited in its capability to traverse throughout all of the turtle tank models we have seen to varying degrees. This has led many, if not all turtle tanks to not be loaded with ammunition on assaults. That being said, I am personally very doubtful, as some have claimed, that no ammo is being taken in the turtle tanks, as I have seen a number of cook-offs. These tanks would imply that shells are being stored on board. Also, why would you just not take some ammo with you, as long as the gun has to point forward and can actually fire? In all cases, you are on the offensive towards the enemy lines. Even if you only have a couple of shells to keep people's heads down, it's probably worth it. Because this is all theoretical and I want a balanced argument, the opposition to my previous statement is that disabling the turret's ability to scoot around is a bold move. Sacrificing offense for survivability is somewhat interesting, but it shows that the tanks are not designed for them destroying enemy positions, but protecting the vehicles behind them. Once we see that turtle tanks are used to protect infantry fighting vehicles or other tanks, then the reason for this modification makes sense. If your job is to be the tank, so to speak, then why bother with the gun at all? The infantry are doing all the fighting, not you. This is not expected to face other tanks, but entrenched positions, something that tanks are not good at in general. They provide support, but it's not something they excel at. There is something else to note here. You may remember earlier in the video I said that some of them have doors on them. This is both for access by the crew, which is fine, but the Ukrainians are saying that these are being used as troop transports during assaults, which makes all sorts of sense. Having a door for a quick dismount is reasonable, but it's basically made the tank heavily armoured and more capable BMP, sort of. What they are doing is making a tank get infantry to a position they need to be, whilst providing a platform for the anti-mine and anti-drone capabilities. To my knowledge, outside of the Indian Army, there are no mine rollers available for the BMP, or other vehicles Russia would be using in an assault, so you need a tank to go first when equipped with these capabilities. And why not stick some soon-to-be meat on there too? After all, a person is more important to the taking of a trench than a tank, so in order to maximise usefulness, you may as well load up on bodies, so to speak. Something interesting has happened though. In June of 2024, the Ukrainians managed to capture a turtle tank. Intact. What makes this even more remarkable is that the capture of this vehicle was caught on camera by a drone. With the assistance of some drone-dropped munitions and an assault squad, the tank crew were taken into the loving hands of Ukrainian custody. The tank was subsequently driven back to Ukrainian lines, where we get this photo of the attack amalgamation and the brave lads that actually took it. After that, a few days later, we had this footage appear online. The tank was being examined by Ukrainian Bubba Ray Dudley, who proceeds to talk to us through what we were seeing, and oh boy, is it something. We get to see that. Number 1, the tank is a T-62, not a T-72, which is what was theorised all of these turtle tanks were being made out of before this video appeared online, showing the Russian use of older tech was becoming more apparent and more prominent. Number 2, the ERA blocks contained no explosives, meaning that the anti-tank countermeasures were essentially inoperable, so that anything that hit the chassis would almost certainly go through the armour and hit something vital on the other side, possibly even killing the driver. 3, there was no ammo in this particular tank, probably because the one in this video has the turret completely fixed in an upward position, making it impossible to hit anything terrestrial. Number 4, there was an electronic warfare device on top, but as the drone was filming it being assaulted, it didn't seem to be working all that effectively. The electronic warfare device was removed and examined during this video, hence why it's not visible in the footage. Number 5, the driver, and by extension the rest of the crew, can only look forward as the armour completely restricts visibility left and right, meaning you essentially have tunnel vision and nothing else. We know from other videos, however, that this has been remedied, and now some are being seen with cameras attached to the outside and a tablet on the inside so that you can see around the vehicle much clearer. Number 6, we see the armour is thin enough to protect from shrapnel, but we also see this which looks suspiciously like a bullet hole to me, meaning that the armour is purely to stop drones. We also see confirmation that this is all salvaged material, as this section was made from electric junction box housing. Part number 7. Some parts of the tank were inaccessible, as exemplified by this hatch being welded shut for God knows what reason. If it has no use, you don't need to spend time making it inaccessible because it doesn't actually change anything. We arrive at point 8. The wiring that connected the tank to the electronic warfare system had been cannibalised from a 1957 field telephone, the TA-57. A minor point is that the TA-57 is currently still being used by Russian forces and has the capability of being used as a low-level torture device by the FSB, allowing for low-level electrocution, as a report by the Mirror showed happened earlier in 2024. This event was separate to the war in Ukraine, but it shows how this little weird wired contraption has many Soviet-style uses. Numero 9. The commander is blind from his position, so that's fun. To top this off, no radio appears in the tank, so even if the commander could see, you can't actually issue any commands. And finally, to round us off at point 10, on the move, it's noisy, big, clunky, smoky, worn out, and just a bit rubbish. Well, that's all well and good, but we only get one small section of that being driven in this video, so is there any other way we can confirm this? It may just be a one-off that this one tank is just worse than all the others, right? As it happens, there's one more piece of first-hand footage of a turtle tank in action. Do you remember that one tank from earlier, the one from very near the beginning that I said was the internet's darling? It turns out there is some footage of that one too, this time from the Russians' perspective. This one, as it happens, is equipped with a mine roller and is the proof we have of internal camera views, which again I mentioned a while back. And I'm going to play some footage from inside it, just a second or two, and I am not altering the sound in any way. This is the actual volume as recorded. If you have not been deafened by that, welcome back. If you have been, blame Russian engineering, not me. I do not accept responsibility for your choice to click on this video. I said it at the start, sentence 16 to be specific, that you should not watch this video. You were warned, so now stop complaining. I do understand that eardrums grow back given time, so just be patient and don't be angry with me. This turtle tank is showing that the tank is still capable of moving at quite some speed despite the clatter. I still wouldn't call it fast, but the armour isn't impeding it in any major way. I am reliably informed that this is a T90 variant, but it could be a T72 to me. I'm no expert in tank identification, but the only way I'd be able to tell reliably is covered up by the armour, so foiled by the Russians again, I guess. The point I was trying to make at that last bit is that if this is indeed a T90, they are converting one of their more capable and valuable vehicles into these diesel detestations, which is either an admission that they are not expecting all that much vehicle-on-vehicle combat, making infantry support armour more valuable, or it is one of the previously damaged vehicles that is now damaged to the point of being able to be returned to fighting condition, so it wasn't worth doing, therefore it was repurposed. Either way, it's not a good look. The really big takeaway from all of this is that if the turtle tank is purely made to survive contact with the enemy, then everything else is pointless and can be forgone, as we are seeing. It does appear that Russia's attempt to break the stalemate is pushing it further to reactivate old technology due to limited resources, scavenge what they can and throw it at the front line, but hey, if it works, it works. Post-production Zippy here. Just so you're aware, in the making of this video, I have since come across some footage of turtle tanks actually shooting. I did make the statement earlier on in the video that they weren't probably carrying all that much ammo. I can now confirm that they are carrying ammo because I've found this video that's currently playing in the background and a couple of others. So when people are saying that they aren't carrying any ammunition, that is now considered bunk.
Ah! Are we there yet?
Yes!
Oh, finally!
In reality, what they are doing is understandable, if a little rubbish. Let's not forget that war makes people do things that seem idiotic, only to have some limited success with those ideas. Sure, the turtle tank is generally a bit pup, but it's still being developed. We are seeing evolutions and updates based on the situation at the front, and they are not done with the concept yet. In a war of attrition, which this has now become, any little advantage is a boon. The turtle tank is barely usable in most situations, but it currently has a role which is being utilised by the Russian Federation's armed forces to some success, and whether they can utilise this new tool effectively enough is yet to be seen. This whole video is showing that what looks moronic is not entirely so, as the concept at the very least has legs, even if the vehicle that is made to use this concept barely works. Why am I, a staunchly pro-Ukrainian guy, saying all of this? Russia is desperate. The Kremlin knows it either bleeds Ukraine dry or it loses due to rising public weariness about the war. Prices in the shops are going up, inflation is at a near record level, and interest rates are damn near impossible to justify. The longer this war goes on, the more likely it is that you, as a Russian, will know someone who won't be returning from the front intact. And that will hit hard. Who folds first? That's anyone's guess right now, but I am still hoping that Ukraine pulls through. It's important for us to remember that Ukraine is not guaranteed to win this, because that's a dangerous mindset to be in. We need to understand that Russia is adapting. They have disbanded battalion tactical groups and frontline aerial sorties because they didn't work, and now the turtle tanks are becoming more and more common because they might be working. We need to acknowledge that Ukraine needs aid, and that aid should be plentiful and readily available. Give them the tools that they need to liberate their land and their people. Russia can be beaten, and Ukraine's little holiday into Kursk shows that. The fact that North Korean troops are now there is proof that Russia is now worried. That is a very good thing indeed. The turtle tanks have interested me for a while now, because it shows that the military world in which we grew up is changing before our eyes. It shows the tank is not useless, but is facing new challenges, and that they will be here for a very long time to come. Most importantly of all though, and this is the most important thing to take away from this video, don't you think they look really stupid? If you've stuck it out this far, thank you kindly. I am no expert on anything I have just spoken about, but I find the entire thing incredibly interesting, and nobody's really done a comprehensive video on these things. I made this video because it's winter now and the evenings are long and there's little to do, and I have been a little ill for a while, so to pass the time I made this. If you have anything to say, please say it. I will have gotten things wrong, and that's okay. We will make mistakes, and I will own up to them where I have made any. I am interested in military history, but have only a general view on most topics, so perhaps I'm not the best person to run a dedicated video on this subject, but nobody else has done that, so I thought it may as well be me. Going forward, I have no plan on doing YouTube full time. In fact, I think I'm only going to get, at best, a couple of thousand views, so if you decide to subscribe, number one, you'd be an idiot, and number two, don't expect frequent videos. I suspect this channel will be the Soviet Womble of military history channels. Long waits between videos, but unlike Womble, when they do drop it will be devoid of any fancy editing, comedy, or general good stuff. I have a few other videos being planned and written right now. They won't be anywhere near as long as this one, as this was a bit special. I wanted something big for my first one, but I want to try and get one video out per month if possible. Honestly, I don't think that's going to happen. Time will only tell if that works out. I will occasionally put out a longer video such as this one, but only whenever they have time to be finished and whenever I've actually got something good to talk about. I will be working on them simultaneously with other projects, so it won't be taking precedence. I have another one of these longer ones in the works, but it's about something specific in the final stages of the Pacific Campaign in World War II, which may come out at some point, but that is a really long way off right now. I should also make it clear from the get-go that I will not be focusing on anything in particular. For example, my next video is about how a single decision that was made decades before World War I led to the Americans having to deal with some awful equipment in 1918. World War I is my favourite topic, but I will talk about just whatever takes my fancy at the time. Don't expect solely Russian invasion of Ukraine content, but that just so happens to be what interested me this month. I will change things up. Who knows, I'm an avid gamer, so perhaps I may one day do a deep dive into something of my favourite games or gameplay features, but anything outside of history stuff won't be common, definitely a secondary concern there. Other than that, you have been awesome, but perhaps if I haven't put you off too much, I may see you next time. Until then, drink irresponsibly, and someone please get me a sponsorship from Martell's. Ta-ra!